This is in fact our 35th week of COVID calls, network calls, call them what you will, in association with the Alliance. And as I always say each week, for those that weren't on last week's call or previous calls, we will be recording it. We share all of our content on YouTube, and we built up a decent following on there. So if you want to share any of the content, then very welcome to go to it and have a peek at what we've been up to. Where are we now? A quick update on the COVID front. Big day at Westminster today. The Chancellor will be revealing the toll that coronavirus has had on the UK economy. And as part of his spending review, we'll be setting out how much money government departments will get over the next 12 months. And in turn, I guess we'll find out how heavily we're going to be taxed in order to try and recover all these costs. Plans to relax the rules on households mixing over Christmas have been branded a mockery by the hospitality industry, given restrictions that will remain in place for firms like pubs and restaurants. Leaders in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland have all agreed that groups of 3 households can meet at home, outdoors or in places of worship from the 23rd to the 27th of December. So that's good news. Boris has saved Christmas of sorts. Shoppers, however, and this is really interesting, are continuing to spend almost up to 2019 levels. We're hoping that basically, and according to Mintel, something like £82 billion will be spent online and in-store over November and December. So I guess both from a retail point of view and from a family point of view, we've had some good news this week, and all of us obviously need to make the right decisions as we go into Christmas. This week we're talking about language, and it's really the turn of the Transcreators. And really, what I wanted to stress to you is that if as a business, and frankly, we all as businesses, I imagine, want to extend our footprint to overseas markets and take opportunities, and with Brexit around the corner, look out to work beyond Europe. Also, I guess it's also worth noting that, closer to home in a world dominated by meme culture, ever-changing social platforms, and the ability to cram your thoughts into 280 characters, your grasp of basic slang can make or break your credibility as a functional and supposedly core human being. And as importantly, the ability to set up your proposition and your client's brand. So, like it or not, language is constantly evolving, constantly changing. New words get added to the dictionary on an almost daily basis, often long after they've become part of our daily lexicon. But some dictionaries have been trying to stay on top of modern languages, and for those that don't know, dictionary.com has actually updated 15,000 words in the dictionary this year. 650 new words were added to keep up with the rapid pace of 2020, whilst the Oxford language, or as we call it, the Oxford English Dictionary, has basically forgone the idea of a single word. We actually will get the word of the year, as it were, partly because of the pandemic, but partly because there's been so many. And what's quite interesting is the way that the pandemic has influenced both culture and the words that we're using in communications. One of the keywords, I suppose, that we've all got used to this year, and some of the zippy new coinage, is words like Bloomsday, or Blursday rather, which captures the way the weeks blend together. And I think we can all relate to that one. Or COVID idiots, or COVIDs, or doom scrolling. But most of us obviously recognise that some of these words have frankly become already overused and quite dull. For example, pandemic has seen a 57,000% increase in use this year. Coronavirus, which was a word that was coined in 1968, has obviously had a bit of an outing this year. And if we go back to January, the most used word on the planet at the time, or at least in now, was impeachment. And obviously by April, the world had changed and we'd all focus on coronavirus. So the pandemic really has turned out to be quite an interesting opportunity for new words to come to the front. And we've all got used to social distancing, flattening the curve, words and phrases like lockdown, stay at home, or WFH, and contact tracing. And even words that we've used in the past like remote and remotely have also had a bit of an outing. So what I'm hoping today is that from our wonderful panel is that we'll get some insight to language, how it's changing, how one needs to take into account local cultures, local traditions, and language in order to be able to land your brand message correctly. The debate will be led or the panel will be led by 4 people, and I'd like to thank each of them. First and foremost, we've got Gary Holt, who's the founder and executive strategic and creative director with over 30 years in branding experience at an agency in London called Someone. They have a global footprint with offices around the world. He has delivered multiple award-winning brand strategies and creative work for clients that include O2, the BBC, Eurostar, Invesco, 3, Reuters, Sky, BT, the Royal Opera House, Telefonica, Tesco's, London 2012, Wolves, ClearScore, and the Royal Mail, to mention but a few. He's also been well represented and led and been a judge for a number of organisations, including DNAD, the Design Council, Promax, and the Art Directors Europe. His work for the Premier League football club Wolves was featured in the Design Museum for Design of the Year. And before establishing Someone, Gary was the Executive Creative Director at La Minam between 1999 and 2005, where, amongst other things, he created the name and identity for O2 and led the BBC rebrand. Mark Alford started out life in regional press production and moved with the invention of the Apple Macintosh into on-screen page makeup, or as we call it today, DTP. In 1995, after a short spell working for an Apple dealer, he started up a Macintosh recruitment business, training and helping with people with pre-press production. He quickly became involved with Adland and supplying multilingual Mac operators, designers and creatives to the likes of Publicis, JWT, Saatchi & Saatchi, Lowe's and Cogent Elliott. Then as a supplier partner, he worked with partners in the Transcreation world at TAG, Hogarth, Gutenberg, Welcome London, and Transcreation agencies like Mother Tongue, World Bank, and of course, Elliott's former creation, Text Appeal. Today, Managed Language is a transcreation and creative production business with skills and services based 100% on international content delivery with adaptation, versioning, and delivery of international brand assets. Managed Language is a partner business and it's here to enable Pimento members to deliver client campaigns internationally. Mark has a team of 4 staff based in London and 5,000 linguists and 900 trans creators worldwide. Silviya holds a BBA in IT and a BSc in Information Systems. She was born and raised in Bulgaria with a Moroccan influence, with her higher education completed in Finland, all of which obviously makes her undoubtedly well placed for a future career in transcreation. She's the marketing manager at Managed Language, and she's bringing her international expertise and experience to help drive businesses forward. And she's worked in a variety of different corporates, from SME startups to B2B SaaS areas, as well as international student recruitment. And finally, Elliott Polak, who joins us from his home in Dubai. Dubai, was born in Manhattan, is the product of multiple cultures: American, Belgian, Danish, Dutch, English, French, Irish, and Norwegian. As he says, his parents couldn't agree the right way to brush their teeth due to unbridgeable cultural differences. He's the chief consultant of Social Dividend Global. They help make strategic decisions safer and easier for global brands such as PepsiCo and Citrix. The international marketeers and innovation leaders whom they work with rely on Elliott and his team to set direction and to seize opportunities. Their job is to deliver the facts that matter and insights that lead to action. And they do this through predictive data and analytics and differentiated listening in 127 markets in 49 languages. And thanks to their outstanding work as insight consultants around the world, they're awarded Best Strategic Insight Consultancy in 2020, 2019, and Best Global Brand Strategy Consultant in 2018. As I always promise you, we always get the best of the best. We've got a hell of a panel today. I think we're all going to learn something new. I certainly will. I'm going to start, if I may, by asking the most obvious of questions to Mark, which is, what the hell is transcreation?
That's a great question, Stephen. It's one that I'm quite often asked. It's, you know, Elliott on this panel can answer it better than me, to be honest, because actually I learned about transcreation from Elliott. But the reality is it's a term that was actually rumoured to have been coined by Steve Parish, once of Tag Worldwide, when he acquired World Writers. His plan was to have transcreators working with creative production staff so that the execution could be produced in language right first time, with 2 people working on the piece. And Steve came up with the concept of transcreation, which of course is the creative production of a multilingual piece. So that's where transcreation comes from. Today, it's taken on a very different life, because when you look at a transcreation piece today, it's very much about content, but more importantly, it's about the true nuance, the value, and the statement that the brand is trying to make in that target language. And therefore, it's become far more involved and more about what we call wordplay and the development of copy based on the target language with back translation, comments, and rationale, so that the brand can actually understand and know that that target language is correctly developed. And in many cases, they mix and match. They'll take the versions that we produce and they'll mix 2 with 3 to get the right fix. But it means that using common sense, copy can be developed based on the true brand values.
And when, as an agency, I don't know how you advise agencies, writers and creators to keep pace with the level of change in language. I mean, how do you understand what's happening at a local level to influence that?
Well, we're very lucky, Stephen, insofar as we have a very active linguistic base, and we engage with them on a daily basis. There isn't a day when we don't get feedback from the market based on how language is being used and how it is flexing and changing. A case in point, one of our clients who has a student affinity marketing business in Germany, we discovered that through feedback from our linguists and also from the student population, that the German language being used on campus was a mixture of slang English and German. And that was something that we found out by rote, really. It wasn't a plan. And as a result, we now, all of our linguists have student-aged children so that they can actually check the copy and approve it based on that German language so that we get the right campus dialect.
Thank you. I'll move over to Elliott, if I may. Elliott, good morning, or good afternoon in your case. As an expert in social listening, what advice do you give to businesses and brands, and how might they have differed to your days when you were at Text Appeal?
Yeah, well, Mark was kindly referring to the time when I was involved in a similar business to his, where we were adapting campaigns to local markets around the world. And what really is different in what I do today is probably number one, I'm working with people, not the same people. In the transcreation business, and I don't know how it is now, but it was at the time, our clients tended to be, say, the global or regional director of advertising at a brand or marketing, but we wouldn't deal with very much with them. We would work very much alongside the creative agency, helping to check if there were cultural issues or cultural insights that were required to make a campaign successful in local markets. And then it was to execute, as I'm sure Mark knows very well. It's execute, say, okay, here's a campaign in 36 markets and it has to be live in all media in 2 weeks, and make sure it happens, make sure nothing goes wrong. So it's a pretty hard proposition. There's not so much strategic insight involved in it as common sense, working with good local people, having good process, and getting things done. I'd be interested to know from Mark if that's still the case, if you're working closely with the agency, because we found that when you worked and were able to work closely with the agency and they were receptive to that and your client perhaps imposed it, then you could get fantastic results. And it often worked well with independent agencies, but that had an international scope. Today, what I'm doing is working with, usually it's the global innovation director or marketing director, providing insight. And so we're talking about, actually probably the biggest issue that they have is making decisions that make sense for the future in terms of new innovation or marketing by understanding local audiences. And there's a big gap. CEOs, I think last year, there was a piece of research that was done over 1,000 CEOs around the world. One of the top 5 threats that they see is an information gap where they don't know what audiences locally are thinking and they don't know how they're going to behave. They don't know what they want. And the information sources from around the world that they get within their organization are extremely inconsistent. So we are trying to help bring facts and fill in that gap. I don't know if that helps to explain the difference. But it is a bit two sides of the same coin, as I think, Stephen, you were saying to me before we started the conversation, where as we're trying to help provide the insight that helps decision makers at global brands then execute what makes sense for them in different markets around the world.
Thank you. And it does. I mean, and Gary, if I may, pull you into the conversation here, add you to the spotlight. When it comes to developing new brands for global businesses, what's the starting point for you? I mean, obviously you work from a brief, but how do you approach the global nature of the task?
Well, yeah, from the language point of view, it's complicated internationally. I mean, I think it's a given for everyone on the call to know that tone of voice, language, etc., is pivotal to a brand. It's not just the way that the brand is projected from its image, but it's also how it talks, its use of language. The biggest challenge we have, to some degree, and actually keeping it on point to the questions you're asking, the huge benefit of transcreation versus just translation, and again, I think we all know this, everyone on the call, is obviously the meaning and the understanding. Because from a strategic point of view, the challenge that you have is you develop a brand, you develop brand values, you develop guiding tone principles, and those can help guide a brand and identity internationally with ease when it comes to images, when it comes to sound, even if you have to allow for different understandings and semiotics of color in a different region. You know, people's understanding of different graphics is different. The challenge you've got is it moves into a sort of a dark art when you then move into language, because you'll have a client who's looking to us as a central branding agency, even with our international connections, to help guide a brand in its market appropriately. But then once it's moved into, I mean, we're working in across Eastern Europe at the moment, so Silviya may be able to add to this. Once some of the work that we've written turns into Bulgarian, have I any idea whether it's on point in terms of tone? Is it talking to the audience in the right way? I mean, I can re-translate it back into English to at least understand what it says, but with no understanding of actually whether it's hitting the right tone. So then it comes into all about the relationship, all about trust, which again, sort of just bringing almost full circle back to where we started, why people like Mark and his agency and the idea of transcreation is just so much more powerful. Because you can very simply, and I don't mean in a Ratner kind of way, you can very quickly undermine a brand by just not sounding correct, sounding too corporate to a commercial environment. I think later in this discussion you'll come on to new words, new language. It's a real minefield for us. I mean, the majority of brands we work with, unless they are incredibly youth focused, we tend to try to not recommend using too much new language unless it's advised by the likes of expertise from people like Silviya and Mark, and obviously from what we've heard from social listening from Elliott.
To that point, Silviya, I don't know whether you can answer that question there from Gary. I mean, how do you go about, helping somebody like Gary in the formation of language?
So I would always do research. I would start with the company that engages with us, the client base, competitors, and the competitors' client base. And I would understand and dig deeper to why a particular market. It's a common trait that when engaging with Eastern Europe, there are quite a few countries grouped together. Let's say Bulgaria and Greece and Hungary and Croatia. Those are 4 very different markets with different languages and different approach. What Gary touched base on the use of new language and what Mark mentioned a bit earlier about Germany and the use of German and English slang across universities and university campuses and students. That won't be very well appreciated in the Eastern European market in terms of Bulgaria, Serbia, and in generally ex-Yugoslavia. I can't speak of Greece and Hungary for the time being, but I'll definitely make sure to do some research and see how would they appreciate the use of new language. And that stems for different reasons, from economic to political, and language is a bit more complicated than just words.
Well, and to that point, you've got those filters of basically culture, you've got So filters to do with generations, you know, the understanding within one generation in an English-speaking market to another generation in an English-speaking market is something that we're all very aware of. And we're also very aware as marketeers of having to keep up with the development of concepts and language and so on. Else we actually end up basically putting ourselves in a bit of a corner and seen as dinosaurs. Give me some examples of brands that either get it right or get it wrong, or anything that's you've seen recently which has amused you.
The brands that have amused me. I would start with someone who's doing it right. Mark and I attended an event a couple of weeks ago, and there was a brilliant talk on the Generation Z and how to approach it by Luke Hodgson, who's the founder of Nerds. And he gave an example of this is your target audience. And it was a bunch of teenagers with baggy clothes. For me, it was a realization that I'm on the other side already, because I was like, oh my God, I don't find this cool and trendy. But apparently for some companies, this is the target audience. Knowing language and knowing languages and understanding different markets definitely helps you avoid hiccups. Like a few years ago, still with the button phones, there was Moto Q, and whoever speaks French or understands a bit of French knows that Q means you're behind. So having such a big hiccup for the French market, including French Canada, so it's not a small market, it means that somebody didn't do their job correctly and they didn't invest enough in the cultural review. There is Captain America at the opening scene in Lagos, a massive backlash from Nigeria because Lagos is such a unique city that you can't replicate it in Atlanta. Companies like Dolce & Gabbana and the terrible ads in China, having a lady eating pizza with chopsticks and a male narration telling her what to do. Needless to say, that was not perceived well by the ladies in China. So those are massive brands, and I've chosen them as different examples from different industries that nobody is safe from going into the faux pas. So cultural review would be definitely very, very important.
You were telling me yesterday, thank you. You were telling me yesterday about the fact that obviously you don't just give best advice to brand owners, you also work with both politicians and senior captains of industry to help them understand before they actually, extend their footprint to a marketplace, what can be expected of them, both in terms of their understanding of the marketplace, but also their gestures, articulations, do's and don'ts. And it surprises me somehow that both, things like members of the royal family always seem to get it right. They always have a well-versed, well-prepped argument when they go into a marketplace. They know kind of the do's and don'ts. There's also an expectation on the other side that the individual concerned will know about royal protocol. When it comes to politicians, partly because of the speed, I guess, that they're working, and partly because they're ignorant sometimes, they seem to make more faux pas than most. I don't know whether you have any examples.
Well, just to be clear, I haven't worked in any formal relationship with politicians, but I did meet Boris Johnson 1 year into his mayorship, where he was celebrating that first year, and introduced myself. And he told me about a faux pas that he had made. He had been the previous week to China, to Beijing, to take the Olympic flag and bring it back to Britain, which is when the London Olympic Games were going to be taking place. And he'd asked me what I did, and at the time I said, well, we help avoid culture shocks around the world. And he said, oh, well, I insulted about 1 billion people, I'm told by my advisors, because people said very bad things about me. And he didn't seem to understand exactly why, but that wasn't much of an issue. I asked, don't you have advisors who tell you before you go to a country like China or elsewhere what to do, what not to do? And he just looked at me and said, why should we care? We're British. Later, he introduced me to some people on his team, but nothing ever came of it. So I don't work with politically exposed people, just so you know. But I don't know if that was necessarily ignorance on behalf of a politician, because if you think of it in pure marketing terms, if you're running to be the mayor, let's say, of London, your audience are the people in London who can vote. They're not the people in China, regardless if you think it's a good or bad thing to be appropriate or not in China. And I think the difference is if you're looking at an international brand or you're looking at a brand that wants to go to new markets or other markets around the world, that they have to think world first and not think their local market and their local audience first. Because you might have 70% of the market like Belahcen in Italy for coffee, but that doesn't mean you have 70%. And you may be the number one, so you can say the number one favorite coffee for Italians, which in Italy means it's sort of a mid-range coffee. You go abroad to another country, you might have 10% of the market. And you might say the favorite coffee of Italians, it takes on a completely different meaning. Oh, this must be a luxury type of coffee. So it really comes into play according to the markets that you're looking at. I think politicians generally, they are being elected by local audiences, aren't they? So they do say a lot of things that may seem strange. Now, what happened with Boris Johnson, we looked it up afterwards, and he didn't look really like a Chinese official. He wasn't formal in China. An official should look quite formal to represent the country well, and he was, his usual self, which eccentric, his hair all over the place, unbuttoned, holding the Chinese flag with one hand and so forth. So it's very criticized for that. But it really depends what audience you're speaking to. I'm not very interested actually working in the political area. I'm interested in working with global brands that are quite aware about how quick the markets are changing around the world, and the fact that there are many opportunities that can be taken very quickly today. And if you miss them, it won't happen a second time. You were talking about words. Just I think the really interesting thing about words, at least from our perspective, are the hashtags now. What conversations does a brand want to be part of? Those hashtags have been emerging, some of them quite new, gaining enormous audiences. Which ones do you jump on? What is your type of conversation within those hashtags? Which ones matter, which ones don't? Once it gets to maturity and the conversation, you have 10 million people in the world on that hashtag, the share of voices will not move anymore. But today, you can take positions. One of our clients is number 4 or 5 in its sector, but in some countries, it's number 1 in terms of share of voice. And they can translate that over the coming years into number 1 in terms of sales. So there are huge opportunities that go beyond words. It actually, the way I see words sometimes like this is not just as meanings, but as territories and playgrounds that you can turn into football fields, and either you're standing on the sideline or you're not.
I mean, that prime example of that, obviously, which happened, through COVID, was the major cultural impacts on Black Lives Matters and then that whole movement. And obviously something that, as you say, was probably driven by hashtag and was trackable on a global basis. What was also interesting was the way that sort of brands did or didn't respond to that global initiative. And I've got a question here from Mark Palmer, who you know well. If you're advising a global brand on issue management, on movements of this nature, whether it's to do with the environment or diversity, or in this case, Black Lives Matters, what would you tell them to do and not to do?
That's a tough question, Steve. I mean, the reality, based on our positioning, and I think this is quite an important, because if you look at where we sit, Gary is probably better placed to answer that question from the point of view of source copy, in terms of what is the brand message that you're trying to deliver. When we get into the actual delivery of the multilingual content into the target language, then the cultural review, and more importantly, the acceptance of that content, really revolves back to the creative. Because the problem we have, and it's an age-old problem, and Elliott knew this as well as I do, of making copy work with creative, and more importantly, making creative fit with the market, is one of the biggest challenges in the transcreation world that we have. Because if you look at the world of the network agency, where they kind of have a one-fits-all creative position, and then they have a worldwide campaign that is then implemented and activated throughout many multiple languages, then our challenge is not, in fact, the creative, but how do we make that work in language? And the brave thing, and in fact, and this again is Gary's domain, would be to get the brand to do creative and concept for the target language rather than having a one-fits-all. And the reason behind that is if you look at brands like The Body Shop or even Dolce & Gabbana, where they have taken a position over the last few years where they now have a market-specific campaign, including language, whereas before they had a one-fits-all. And the reason that came about was because they found that, you know, as we know with all creative, you know, 50% of what we produce doesn't work. It's just that we don't know which 50% it is. But what we found in those international campaigns, especially with Body Shop, is their marketing was not working at all. In the moment the UK concept was created, transcreated, and then delivered, the messaging and indeed the actual offer was completely wrong.
Yeah, I mean, to take that point, and again, I've got a question here from Mark Palmer, probably best addressed, well, anyone can address it, but I'm going to pin Gary on this one, if I may. You know, with Brand Britain, call it what you want, Brand UK, in the last 4.5 years, you know, ever since the Brexit and more recently, obviously, in some of the activities and some of the other things we haven't done around the world, has been to some extent damaged, and our international reputation isn't what it was. As we come out of COVID and come out of the recession and enter Brexit properly, if you were given the brief tomorrow to rebuild Brand Britain, what would the starting point be?
Wow, make it an easy question. Well, I think coming out of that, and I think well, one thing I've noticed, and it does, luckily, it does connect quite nicely with the topic we're talking about, is this feeling of maybe not self-reflection, but actually this ability to be able to look back on what we're doing and what could we change, what could we make better. So from a Brand UK point of view, there's also this slight concern. I wonder whether it's a jingoistic thing, given that a lot of us, I'm certainly no, and Elliott's not, a lot of us are based in the UK. We think we have sort of some God-given royal rights with the use of language, particularly if it's in English, because the use of English, it gets integrated so much into other languages, etc. I think that's been touched on before. So I think that's certainly something that we need to be expanding upon. We need to be looking like the languages. I mean, and language is always evolving. Again, it's another total obvious point to make, but certainly from that point of view, looking that using language actually to project it forwards. Because at the moment, as I say, with this self-reflection, a lot of what we've been doing has been looking retrospectively backwards about what we've been going through. So I think use of positive language, how we might project that would be important. Not least internationally. I mean, again, we have this sort of feeling because we think we sit from a central brand point of view and we're talking English that we are setting the rules. Well, no, multiple, because thanks to the global market, a lot of these brands, they need to feel Bulgarian, or they need to feel, I mean, I'll use O2. I mean, I think Susie's on the call as well, who was instrumental in creating O2. I will bring it back to your question, Stephen, in a moment. The O2 market in Germany, they feel like it's a German brand. So I think this feeling that there's sort of a, we should take, again, taking your question and making it language related, that we have some God-given right over how this language is moving forward, I think is wrong. I think the more that we can take on social listening internationally and using Elliott's point of view, I think that will help us. And that's not just about sort of trying to look international and global. I just think it's actually being much more aware of actually what's happening to our brand, being positive and actually embracing different terms, etc. Not sure if that's quite answered your question, because from a language point of view, obviously, as opposed to a creative brand itself.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, it's a tough question to ask, particularly when it's not been given the opportunity to prepare.
Can I just a quick word on that? Because I thought what Gary was saying is actually quite important. There's a difference between a nation's self-perception and perception of its own language and what it means and its universalism, and the outside perception of the nation. So if Britain were to be marketed to other countries, maybe the way people perceive Britain is completely different from how I became British about a year ago, so I say we now, although no one will ever agree that I'm British, how we self-perceive. And I'm French as well, but no French person will ever agree to that. That's a difference culturally, by the way. I'm American. Well, if you become American, then you are American. But to become British or French is a whole different ballgame, I've learned. Sorry, I'm going on a tangent. My point is, one thing we learned through social listening, for instance, in coronavirus, is the self-perception of different countries of how well they have fared as a country and how well their government has fared facing this challenge. And some of it is not really unexpected. A lot of Americans think they haven't fared so well. But Japan, which is a country which has had one of the best rates of control and has been one of the more successful, I don't know if that's the right word, policies towards coronavirus, has the lowest self-evaluation of how well they have fared. The negative sentiment in Japan, 70%, that they have done badly in managing coronavirus. So if you were to say to someone in Japan, well, how shall we speak about Japan to the rest of the world if we want to make Japan a stronger brand again? You'd really have to distinguish self-perception from external perception of Japan, because we think, well, Japan has done actually quite remarkably well.
Yeah, and I think that's the point, isn't it? The starting point is to understand how people feel and how they respond to that brand Britain, brand UK, outside obviously the UK, in order to be able to influence change and ensure that obviously you land your new brand message.
And what I do, what struck me, I'm sorry, it's just because it really, I was in the UK a few months ago and was living there at that time. And it really seemed like a number of decisions could have been a little bit more, it would have helped to look at other countries and try to use some of the best practice coming from other countries where things had happened first. So I felt, and a number of people around me, quite critical of how things were going. And then I started speaking to my American friends. They're saying, you guys are doing so much better in Britain.
It's a relative term, isn't it, really? Yeah, 250,000 versus, 51,000, sadly.
Well, things were being done. And they might have been many mistakes being made, but nonetheless, action was being taken. And it wasn't, and it's a complicated thing as to why, and I have no expertise as to why. But it's more about the self-perception.
Absolutely, but also at the heart of it is communication. And the thing that basically all governments have been accused of is the clarity of communication, the use of words. So it comes back to the central thought of today and about language itself. And Silviya, obviously somebody who's grown up very much in an international, multicultural world, and you've traveled an awful lot, now living in the UK. I mean, your perceptions and view, I suspect, to Elliott's point, of brand Britain will be different to those of somebody who was born here, brought up, and has always lived here and knows only Britain. So, I mean, again, if you're given that challenge as an agency to say, right, we need to go and basically regroup, we need to get back out there and to reassert what we're about. And if that was the brief that you took, presumably you would go about it in the same way as you go about any brief, any brand.
I would. I think that what gives me a competitive advantage is the experience. So I was lucky enough to be brought up in an international environment, to travel, to be an international student, and to be exposed to international markets. A few years ago, I used to work with international students. So I have, if not basic understanding, a bit more to how to approach different markets and how to market a British brand across different markets. And this is all due to being exposed to that international environment and understanding how a brand may be perceived. I would always handle it from the point of research, because if we don't challenge ourselves to why expanding to a certain market, then in my opinion is not a great starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to build on that, and maybe Elliott, you could help me on this one, is when you are tracking sentiment and you're looking at actually what is and isn't in vogue around the world through both social listening and some of the works you do, I imagine most of the time, are you tracking and tracing in English as the primary language, or are you doing exactly the same exercise in French, German, Italian? I mean, what is the kind of the global authority in social language?
No,
Well,
it depends on the customer. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Sylvia.
I would begin with English and then I would follow up with Bulgarian and Finnish just to see if there is any kind of difference in the information I would find online. And I would trust reliable sources and not Wikipedia.
Well, we were providing analysis for a multinational soft drinks company that had a number of challenges in one of its largest markets in the Middle East due to taxation on sugar and changes in perception of carbonated drinks and changes in also sentiment regarding physical fitness and so forth. And it led to a big price hike for the company's soft drinks, but they wanted to know if there were threats that were coming up. Well, this is all in various dialects of Arabic because this is a consumer brand. And that's the language that people speak. And whether they understand or not English is completely irrelevant. That's not their emotional language. That's not the language in which they think, in which they have conversations. Another brand that we work with, we actually looked into this and we found that their clients, more business to business brand, they all had some participation in local languages. So you have about 20 local languages around the world that matter. And then there was English, but the local languages had about less than 0.1% impact in terms of conversation versus English. So you make decisions according to what kind of brand you're working with, what kind of markets they're in. But one thing always to remember, I mean, I was surprised by what I just said, that we found that local language is so irrelevant to this brand in particular, because it's well known from research that people are perfectly bilingual. Let's say, think of people in like you people, and then people in Sweden, or, you know, you could easily do an ad campaign in English in Sweden, and probably everybody would understand it perfectly well, or most everybody. And they would make completely different decisions than if the campaign was in the local language. Because when people are asked to make decisions, the same decision, you can have two control groups. Should we turn this train so that it goes crazy train off and destroys the city and many people will die, but the people in the train will be saved? Or shall we turn it on this track so that no one in the city will die, but everyone on the train will die? Actually, you have completely different decisions being made if the question is asked in the native language versus the learned language. I think that's a really important thing about language. It's not the meaning, it's the emotion that it conveys, because emotions is what leads to actual decisions that people make.
Yeah, I mean, and I think on that point, and Gary, you just you made a point there in the chat box about the reality is that we're moving at such speed these days, and where you communicate and how you communicate requires sometimes, you know, split-second decisions, you know, particularly in the social world. But equally, it's the same for brands. You know, you don't have the luxury of being able to always, you know, research, understand. You know, you have to sometimes make a decision on gut, and sometimes that can go horribly wrong, but sometimes it can work out just well.
Yeah, I mean, I for us, or for myself, I think that's the crux of the issue. And I think you've also mentioned social. I mean, going back very quickly over what we've discussed before, whether it's about Boris Johnson, you know, for example, we have a naming department. You know, we name brands. We do lots of cultural checking, gross negative checking around words. It's quite. We would do the same if it was a major campaign and it was the key headline or a strap line. We can ensure that that's understood. The sentiment of the meaning is not just translated, but it's actually understood. But that's not really the problem. I mean, those are what we do on a day-to-day basis. The problem is often when we get involved or a comms agency get involved, but bringing the brand to it doesn't matter how much the guidelines try to tell you this is the brand, this is the tone of voice, these are your values, please follow these principles. When you have doesn't matter what age, let's 25-year-old person who's running the social media in markets, unless they understand the use of language and they're using it properly, then that's actually where there'll be a massive disconnect, because it's speed even beyond what we're used to discussing from a comms point of view, because the brand is live. So that is literally the brand is talking to you, whether it's from social media, whether it's ongoing advertising, whether it's the website, etc. And that, I think, again, almost going full circle back to where we started, is why relationships with transcreation or with writers who understand how to write rather than, and again, I know it's obvious, rather than just translate, is key to the brand. Because that's where, it doesn't matter how great that we've set a brand identity up at its, when it's first introduced in market, you can very quickly unpick all that. If it just doesn't, it just does not, it's sounding too youthful or it's sounding too corporate. I think one of your questions before we came on, Stephen, around successes we've had in the past. I mean, interesting enough, we used to herald years ago, we did the rebrand of BSI internationally. It was a major success because it was only writing core, very complicated rules. So the translation and the transcreation actually was easy. When you're talking about a commercial brand like O2 in Germany or a B2C brand in Bulgaria, for example, how that lands and how it talks can literally be now fundamentally whether it appeals to me or not. Doesn't matter how great, I'm not here to diss logos, doesn't matter how great a logo is, if that brand does not talk in my language, I will struggle to engage with it.
Mark, as a build on that, how do you get clients to be brave about language and really take and push it?
Well, the key challenge with language is it flexes and moves, and the big problem, and it's both opportunity and problem, is if you look at the reality of language, more transcreators, linguists will have English and their mother tongue than any other language pair. And as a result, what tends to happen in our market is, if you take Japan as a good example, a Japanese brand typically will go from English to all of the other target languages from Japanese. And it's quite a good point, because if you look at some of the faux pas that have happened in the years, and these are historic, but I'll reference them. And Mitsubishi as a company has probably done more than any, but the worst one that they did, which I think is the funniest, is the Mitsubishi Starion. I don't know if anyone can remember that car, but it was a muscle car. Well, it was meant to be called the Stallion, and it was meant to compete with the Mustang. But because the Japanese brand manager couldn't say stallion, he was saying Starion because he was Japanese, the American copywriter thought that they wanted to call it a Starion. So the Starion was born, and by the time they realized the mistake, all the branding was done, all the decal, the whole thing had happened. And my point, in terms of trying to advise clients on brand, is the weakness that we have, and it is a real weakness, is that because English as the spoken language is so prevalent amongst the transcreation community, the reality is that even though they speak and understand English, their mother tongue is the language that we want them to use. And it's that classic lost in translation, because if you think about, and this is really Gary's domain, when you think about language development, brand language, tonality, the real intonation of the brand and the brand values based on a language piece, where language is without doubt one of the most powerful things when mapped to imagery. And then when you look at social blogging and social listening, which of course Elliott is doing, which is an unbelievably advanced service when you look at the hashtag, it all ultimately fails if the language, which is what we're trying to convey and deliver, is not understood at the very core of the inception of the project. And that's really one of our challenges. So it's not really about getting the client to be brave, it's getting the client to understand the problems that we have when we have to transcreate. Because if it was easy, and in some cases it can be tremendously easy, but in most instances, you could be looking at weeks of research to come up with taglines, bylines, and more importantly, nuances that are brand specific in a target language based on cultural acceptance, and more importantly, the correct use of that tone, the correct use of that language. So it's an incredibly difficult position, but brands are becoming more aware and they are becoming easier to deal with in that sense. But the truth is, machine translation is probably the best tool we've got at the moment, because it's so bad in certain instances. It's helping us to do a good job.
That, I think, really probably takes us to the end of today's presentation. I'd like to thank everybody for participating in our panel. Lots of very interesting questions. We didn't get on to talk about new words. Earlier on, one of the members of the audience today said, I'd love to understand what's new, what's hip, what's happening in words. All I will say is if you look at basically what's gone into the English Oxford Dictionary this year, there's an awful lot of words to do with cooking. I think one of the things we've all spent an awful lot of time doing lockdown has been cooking. So from bakeable to codwar to cook chill to breading to code switching, cookless. Well, I think it's probably cookless actually. I might have that one wrong. But there's plenty of cooking and cooking related words that have gone in there. There's also some fairly negative ones like a suicide belt, which is a regional zone which suicide rates are particularly high. And then tatted, again, very popular this year. That's when you've had a tattoo tatted up. And this one's quite fun too. A gypsy tart is a sweet tart with a filling made of evaporated milk and sugar, chiefly made in Kent. So, I mean, there's thousands and hundreds of new words and phraseologies, from wig to fit to salty, that are kind of creeping their way into the common parlance. And it makes obviously transcreation that much more difficult, because you need to know what the local equivalent is, if there is one, and you need to know whether actually it's a fashionable word or a word that's going to be hanging around, and therefore you want somehow to use that in the language. If I may, very, very quickly, before we lose you all, just wanted to say 2-3 things. One, we've got the annual membership survey, the Pimento annual membership survey, coming to a close this evening. If you haven't already completed your survey, please just take 5 minutes to do that. Obviously, only by listening, and that's what we've been talking about today. To our members, are we able to continue to evolve our membership offer? Also, I'd like to say, if anybody is interested in basically becoming a guest on one of our future events, please let me know. We're putting together the schedule for next year. On Thursday this week, you saw on the text box earlier on, Woven, which is one of our agencies, a creatively led brand engagement agency, will be hosting the 5 p.m. club. All we need is your presence, and we would suggest you bring a glass of wine with you, and we'll be doing a number of breakouts, and you get the opportunities to meet other members of the network. And then finally, you may have read yesterday that Pimento has taken a stake in the recently formed Alliance of Independent Agencies. The Alliance promotes the DNA of independent agencies as being a distinct choice for clients. So it's there to represent the independent sector as a whole, and we're working with them to lobby on behalf of the independent sector, working with the Advertising Association and their membership of the Federation of Small Businesses and the debating group. In addition to that, they also offer a very extensive training program that seeks to engage from agency leaders to future leaders. And their Green Jam sessions are probably well known to many of you, particularly our younger viewers. In many respects, the Alliance is a yin to our yang, if you like. So we're very excited about how we're going to be pushing that development, and how we're going to be working with them over the coming months and years. And interestingly enough, we've negotiated an arrangement whereby any member of Pimento that wishes to become a member of the Alliance will enjoy a 25% discount. So if you're interested in knowing more about the Alliance, or would like to find out what's involved or get involved, please contact myself or your partner director. That's all I have for today, beyond thanking everyone for joining, and wishing you all well, and looking forward to seeing you, many people on Thursday as at all possible, and as many people on our call next week. Thank you very much again, and have a good day. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.